with tonight's activities. Thank you all for coming to this, the final scheduled event in our fall 2020 forest programming with the Humanities Center at Texas Tech. I'm Michael Borshuk. I am an associate professor in the Department of English and the director of the Humanities Center at Texas Tech. And I'm very glad to see so many of you here for Lee Klinger's talk, Forest Restoration Theory and Practice Based on Indigenous Cultural Tending. Before I turn things over to our host for the evening, though, I am going to make a couple of quick announcements. We are about to formalize all of our spring 2021 programming, continuing the forest theme through the end of the academic year. And these are some of the events that you can look forward to next semester. In early February on the 4th, we'll have a reading by poet and essayist Ross Gay. Thursday, February the 18th, we have a presentation by our own Bruce Clark on Richard Powers' novel, The Overstory. In March, we have a reading by the poet, essayist, journalist, and translator Christopher Merrill. In late March, we have a presentation on the photography of trees and forests with Maria Whiteman, Diane Cook, and Len Genschel. And then 2 events in April, a panel on tree law moderated by Texas Tech's Vicki Sutton. And then towards the close of the semester, April 22nd, a panel on forest restoration and regeneration with Don Denby, David McConville, and Andy Lipkiss. The easiest way to stay abreast of the forest programming and take note of Zoom registration links is to bookmark the Humanities Center website at humanitiescenter, all one word, .ttu.edu, and look for these events under our events tab. We'll have registration links up there soon. You can also follow us on social media. We have Twitter and Instagram accounts, both of which our handle is at TTUHUMCTR, and then we also have a Facebook account where we announce all of our events and programming. That's TTU Humanities Center, all one word, on Facebook. So please follow us in any or all of those ways and look ahead to this great dynamic programming we have scheduled as we continue talking about forests and this theme into the spring semester. Finally, before we begin tonight's event, as always, I want to offer the Humanities Center at Texas Tech's Land Acknowledgement Statement. The Humanities Center at Texas Tech opens its officially sponsored events with an acknowledgement of the Indigenous people on whose lands we host our talks and gatherings. The center opens its events with this gesture as part of our commitment to respecting the shared humanity of different populations across diverse cultural traditions, and to remembering with clarity the complex and violent truths of our history. With that in mind, we acknowledge the sacred grounds on which we stand, the traditional homelands of the Apache tribe of Oklahoma, the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes, the Comanche Nation, the Jicarilla Apache Nation, the Kiowa tribe of Oklahoma, and the Mescalero Apache tribe of the Mescalero Reservation. We pay respect to their elders past and present. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, trauma, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today. With that, I'd like to turn things over, as I've done multiple times this semester, to the chief programmer of our forest theme for this year, my colleague in the Department of English, Bruce Clark, who is the Paul Woodfield Horn Distinguished Professor of Literature and Science, and he'll be our host for the evening. Thank you, Bruce.
Okay. Thank you, Mike. I like that. I'm the chief, the big chief. So in my ceremonial duties as chief, let me just recap the goals of the forest program that's concluding its fall run of events tonight, but we'll be back, as Mike told you, with a new slate of forest themed events in the spring. So all this academic year, we have been and will continue to be thinking about forests, what they are, how they work. For instance, how they moderate climate at the planetary scale, and thus why their preservation truly matters. We'll be thinking with forests to consider how we modern humans, the occasionally irresponsible beneficiaries of forests for thousands of years, might learn from the trees better behaviors, making positive differences in face of the ecological challenges we currently confront. So I'd like now to toss it over to my sidekick for the evening, my colleague, Dr. Vicki Sutton, who will co-moderate with me tonight.
Thank you, Bruce, and thank you very much for making me part of this. I'd like to say it's great that we're able to partner this along with also American Indian Heritage Month, since we have the opportunity to do that and add that to our list of events at Texas Tech. I am Lumbee. I'm a member of the Lumbee Indian Nation, and I'm a law professor at in the law school at Texas Tech. I'm an environmental scientist as well as a lawyer. So I'm pretty excited about this panel and so happy to welcome you, Lee, to the event. And we're just really delighted to have you here. And thank you all.
Thanks, Vicki. So let me introduce Lee real quick, and then we're going to turn it over to Lee and let him take it away. Dr. Lee Klinger is an independent scientist living in Big Sur, California, where he serves as director of Sudden Oak Life, a movement aimed at improving the health of trees and forests in California and elsewhere through practice, education, and research. Lee has over 30 years experience in the environmental sciences at major institutions in the US, the UK, and China, with over 50 peer-reviewed publications in the fields of ecology, botany, atmospheric chemistry, geology, geophysiology, and complexity. And he's held scholarly appointments at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, the University of Colorado, the University of Oxford, and the Chinese Academy of Sciences. But for all that, he mainly hangs out in Big Sur and does his thing in the California environment. How was that, Lee? Did that cover the bases? You're muted.
There we go. Yes, thank you very much.
Okay.
Yay.
All right. It's all
Thank
yours.
you, Michael, Vicki, Bruce. It's quite an honor to be here and speaking. I have been looking forward to this talk, and I've listened in on all the other talks, and I feel like I'm in wonderful company, and I'm hoping I can add to and expand the discussion you guys have started here. Fascinating. Okay, let me start by sharing my screen. Okay, so today I'll be talking about forest restoration, both the theory and the practice that is based on indigenous cultural tending. Now, why isn't it? I guess I got to use that button. There we go. I'd like to do my own land acknowledgement. This is brought to you from the land of the Esselen tribe. Esselen means the rock. The rock is also known as Point Sur here in Big Sur, California. And Point Sur, I'm fortunate enough to have right outside my window. This is the view from where I live, looking out at the rock, Point Sur. The overview for today, I'd like to start talking briefly about Gaia theory, particularly the role of ecosystems, forest and peatland ecosystems. Then I'd like to speak a bit about ecological succession or ecological development. All living systems go through developmental sequences, ecosystems do as well. Then I'd like to talk a bit about fire ecology in California, both the historical burning by the native people and the aberrant behavior of the modern fires. Then I'd like to speak about the evidence for cultural modification of trees and landscapes. Some examples such as pollarding, middens and soil fertility, terracing, and then finally I want to show you what we're doing in terms of approaching forest restoration, both by expanding the use of cultural fire and by using a technique we call fire mimicry. The idea of the living earth is an ancient idea. It goes back thousands and thousands of years. It's part of almost every indigenous culture in the world. The Greeks, Sumerians all brought up the idea of a living earth. So it's not a new concept, but what is new is the scientific formulation of the idea that the Earth's a living system, and that is what we call Gaia theory. Gaia, named after the Greek goddess for the Mother Earth, was developed by James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis. And here are some of their descriptions of what they mean by Gaia theory. Simply put, Lovelock states the Earth is alive. Another definition, the temperature and composition of the Earth's surface are actively regulated by the sum of life on the planet and the biota. Gaia is autopoietic, meaning it recognizes, regulates, and creates conditions necessary for its own continuing survival. And Gaia is best thought of as a superorganism. Now, I disagree with Lovelock on a couple things, but this is one. I actually would consider Gaia, if you're going to call it a super anything, it's really a super ecosystem. Just a minor disagreement. I first met James Lovelock and his wife Sandy back in 1988 at a Chapman conference hosted by the American Geophysical Union on the Gaia hypothesis. And at the time, at this meeting, Jim was arguing that Gaia likes it cold. He was making that point, which was kind of a strange point for some of the scientists there, but he simply mentioned that, look, throughout most of the history of the Earth for the last 500,000 years, 80 to 90% of the time has been spent in ice age conditions. And also during those ice age conditions, carbon dioxide, and these are measurements from the ice cores in Antarctica, were shown to decrease significantly during these ice age events. And his argument was that carbon that was in the atmosphere was going into biomass during the ice ages. So during the ice ages, there was more biomass, hence lower CO2, than during the interglacials, where there was less biomass and higher CO2. At that same conference, I was presenting a paper that Jim hadn't known about because this was all brand new information at the time, where I had developed independently of Lovelock's idea that that Gaia likes it cold, a set of feedbacks that involve ecosystem succession, particularly peatland formation, that is actually a significant cooling mechanism that can result in ice age climates and create positive feedback loops over a certain period of time until the ice sheets advance. And then you have a negative feedback loop. So this is a potential nice system that not only accounts for the high biomass that Lovelock was predicting during the ice ages, but also provides a biological mechanism for how those ice ages could be regulated. I've taken this one step further with David Erickson in a paper where we were looking not only at the dynamics of terrestrial ecosystems, but also the dynamics of marine ecosystems and how these two could be coupled in a way that could enhance the cooling mechanism. So my focus early on with Gaia theory really has been around trying to understand how ecosystems can warm and cool the planet. Now, during that time, and most of that work was done while I was at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, NCAR. NCAR had a program called SOARS, Significant Opportunities in Atmospheric Research and Science, that was open to a number of students from minority and underrepresented backgrounds to give them opportunities for studying atmospheric science. I was assigned, Carl Etzedy was assigned to me actually to study his work in atmospheric science. And when I first met him, I was explaining to him about Gaia theory, and he looked at me and he said, "Oh my gosh, my mom always said that the Earth was alive." And I have to tell you, that was a major shift in my thinking around Gaia, because up until then, I always viewed Gaia as a hypothesis. And what Carl really showed me was that, no, there's whole cultures of people that don't consider it a hypothesis. They believe that the Earth is alive, and they've developed their livelihoods and knowledge in societal cultures around that idea that the Earth is alive. And it is the one thing that has, in my mind, helped me understand the importance that Indigenous peoples have played in not only recognizing Gaia, but actually helping reinforce the health and state of the Gaian system. I now want to talk a bit about ecosystem development. And one of the, like I mentioned, all systems, all living systems, organisms, for instance, go through a life cycle, a period of, infancy and adolescence and maturity and old age. And these are very predictable cycles. Well, ecosystems do the same. And while ecosystems are very long-lived, many thousands of years, it's very difficult to just sit there and watch an ecosystem change over that time frame. So what we've come up with are ways that we can reconstruct the development of ecosystems through what we call chronosequence studies, which are simply studies that look at land areas and recognize how space and time are correlated in these landscapes. And in this case, this is from the Hudson Bay lowland. And the Hudson Bay lowland has been gradually rising out of the Hudson Bay since the end of the last ice age, when all the land that you see in this picture was depressed under the weight of the ice sheet to below sea level. Well, as the ice has melted and the land has come back up, the shorelines have gradually receded and created essentially a 5,000-year-old continuous sequence of ecosystem development or ecosystem succession. And here's just a generalized succession from one of those pathways, the mesic pathway. And what you can see is that both site age, which are these X's based on radiocarbon dates, and soil water pH indicate as a system ages, the acidity of the system increases or the pH decreases. And we also see these very regular sequences going from salt marsh, freshwater marsh, tamarack, fen, black spruce, bog forest, and finally the sphagnum bog. And it turns out that indeed, sphagnum bog is what we consider a climax community in many of these northern areas, perhaps even globally. I've also done chronosequence studies in Southeast Alaska, where we pieced together the essentially the succession of land after the glaciers have receded there. So we, at the end of the Little Ice Age, a couple hundred years ago, we started seeing glacial recession in Southeast Alaska. And as the glaciers receded up the valleys, we have a very nice chronosequence of different age surfaces, the oldest being near the head of the valley and the youngest up slope. I've been, the glacial sequences show the first part of the succession And the later stages of the succession, I've been able to fill in looking at gradual upslope stabilization on Mount Edgecombe here in Southeast Alaska, which has also created a chronosequence. Putting those together, we get a typical developmental sequence in Southeast Alaska, which is actually quite similar to other places where you go through meadow and shrub stages to forest stages and finally to sphagnum bog. And again, as the sites age, the surface soil pHs decrease significantly. So aging and acidification in ecosystems goes hand in hand. And also note that in none of these places are forests climax ecosystems. Forests are just a stage along the way to what in these places are climax peatland ecosystems. One of the most remarkable things about Southeast Alaska when I first went there back in the late 70s, I was not expecting to see this. I had in my mind that Southeast Alaska forests, which are pretty much pristine forests, untouched, here and there occasionally logged, but 90% of the forests haven't been touched by any kind of commercial logging. They're distant from any pollution sources. There was no reason for me to believe that these forests would be anything other than the finest, healthiest trees and forests that I'd ever seen. Well, when I arrived in Southeast Alaska, this was the typical view of an old growth, undisturbed forest. And it took me years to get my mind around why all these trees were dying. One of the key processes that we find when we're looking at the development of ecosystems through a soil perspective is that as forests acidify and mosses build up, you have a process called podzolization, where you have acids that are produced by the mosses at the surface that leach out minerals, create an E horizon, which is essentially like a leached horizon. And those minerals, iron, aluminum, and other things concentrate lower below and precipitate out as, in this case, an iron pan. Well, these iron pans can get so thick they can essentially stop the flow of water downward and perch it and help enhance the, essentially enhance the habitat for which the mosses can grow. An advanced stage of podzolization is what we call polutification, where these podzolized soils, like I mentioned, perch the water table, and then the peat mosses can start growing much more luxuriantly to the point where they can accumulate several meters of peat. And in this case, what you end up having is a forest. Here are some old stumps at the base that is completely replaced by sphagnum bog. So to understand what's going on here, we have to start to appreciate the ecology of mosses and lichens. And this is one of the biggest blind spots in ecology today, especially in terms of forest decline and the role of, especially the role in soil formation and soil chemistry. Mosses produce acids, and I mean significant amount of acids. This is an example of sphagnum mosses that are producing acids down to a pH below 3.0. We've had many records of soil water pHs underneath sphagnum mosses, which are in the 2s and low 3s in the pH scale. When you see mosses covering the bark of trees like this is a significant stressor on the trees. The mosses are producing acids which are actually degrading the bark of the trees. Now remember, the bark is the skin of the tree. It's the first line of defense against diseases and insect pests. So when these mosses grow thickly on the trees, they are actually degrading the bark and enhancing the chance for disease and insect problems in the trees. This happens to be in California. This is an anomalous situation. Why? Because normally fires would have burned through here and you would never get this kind of moss buildup in the presence of a regular fire regime. I've also studied the role of mosses in tree roots. And I've done lots of these studies where you can take cores underneath a moss mat in a forest, and then right nearby where there are no mosses, analyze the roots. And what we find, here's an example of several studies we've done, is that the number of live roots, and these are fine roots of trees, are significantly lower compared to non-moss sites. And also the number of dead roots, where we were able to count those, are significantly higher in the moss sites compared to the non-moss sites. So the expected ratio of mosses, if mosses had no direct effect on tree roots, should be around 1. But as you can see, we have now a number of studies that are suggesting mosses are having a significant effect on tree roots. Well, if they're having an effect on tree roots, they're having a significant effect on tree health. Of course, you can just do the study, which I did at an NCAR back in 1998, where you plant trees, half of them with no moss and half of them with moss, and you can see the results. Mosses are definitely stressing and in some cases killing trees. Lichens also produce acids. Excuse me. And lichens are both growing on the ground and also up in the tree. When you see a tree with this much lichen cover, you know that tree is stressed. Now, there's a popular meme that the lichens don't hurt the tree. They are just using the tree as a host to grow on, but they have no negative effect on the trees. That is a myth. If you go into the literature, and I'm just stuck on here as many papers as I could on one page, there's more. But there is a whole literature showing that epiphytic lichens, the lichens that are growing up on the leaves and branches of the trees, are significantly having adverse effects on the hosts, including oak trees and poplar trees. So we can no longer accept this harmless lichen meme that's going around. And scientists really need to start taking a closer look at the role of lichens in affecting the health of trees and soils where they grow. Now to talk about the fire ecology of California. An important paper came out a few years ago by Stevens called Prehistoric Fire Area and Emissions from California's Forests, Woodlands, Shrublands, and Grasslands. And in that paper, and this is a quote, "This work estimates that approximately 1.8 million hectares of California wildlands burned annually in the prehistoric period." Well, for perspective, in 2018, the deadliest and most destructive wildfire season on record prior to 2020, fires burned 766,000 hectares in California, or just 43% of the pre-1800 annual average. In other words, yes, we're seeing some big fires these days, but these fires, at least in terms of area, are not unusual. That the areas that we're seeing burned even in our high fire years are on average or on par for what was burned almost every year by the indigenous people historically. What's different, of course, is that the fires are much more destructive. We have lots of forest decline these days, which wasn't anywhere near as severe back in the Native America era. We have, as of 2018, 147 million dead trees in California. Back in 2017, they reported 834 million dead trees in Colorado. These are astounding numbers, and they're something we need to be aware of, and that are playing a significant role in the cause of these massive wildfires. So unburnt forests are overcrowded. Here's a picture of a giant sequoia tree that I took a few months ago up in Sequoia National Park. And in this picture, if I'd have taken this picture 100 years ago or so, there would only be one tree, only one tree in this picture would be visible right now, or back then, I should say. All of the trees other than the giant sequoia in the foreground would not have been there. Why? Because these areas were regularly burned, and the reproduction of the trees around was kept suppressed by the fires, so that the giant sequoias had the resources they need to be able to grow so large and tall. We know that from tree ring studies, a paper that just came out a couple years ago, fire suppression makes forests more dense and less tolerant of drought, pests, and wildfires. Notice I'm not talking a lot about climate, mainly because I think there's an overemphasis on climate change in playing a role in the decline of the forests and the severity of the fires. Well, I think it has some role. I don't believe it has the major role. I think that the main problems with our forests are due to lack of tending, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So wildfires are becoming more destructive, not necessarily more extensive, but definitely more destructive due to the heavy fuel buildup that's occurred during the course of all the years when fires were suppressed. So what are some of the consequences of fire suppression in California? Well, as I mentioned, acidification and loss of alkaline-rich nutrients in the soil. That's what happens when soils get acidified. We're seeing a buildup of mosses and lichens. Fire and smoke are nature's way of controlling mosses and lichens in these systems. So without fire, the mosses and lichens are having the time of their lives. Overcompetition in forests and the buildup of fuels is occurring. There's an increase in pathogens and insect pests, including ticks. Remember, fires are nature's way of controlling a lot of these pathogens and insect pests. There's a decline in broadleaf trees, an increase in conifers. Well, the broadleaf trees tend to be the trees and the species that are more valuable for wildlife. There's an increase in susceptibility to drought and canopy fires. There are air quality extremes that we're seeing now. We're going from very clean air to very, very bad air quality in a very short period of time. We're seeing shift in from perennial to ephemeral streams, a decline in the native flora, wildlife, and pollinators. So let's talk about culturally modified landscapes. California is a culturally modified landscape. There is no place in California that is or ever was unmanaged. It's a myth that there are any true wilderness areas in California. The whole state is a culturally modified system. Here's a picture from Big Sur where I live. And in this picture, I can see grasslands and oak woodlands and bay forests and chaparral and redwood forests, all within the same watershed. Now, grasslands require burning every few years to maintain themselves, whereas redwoods only need fire every few decades. So this mosaic of ecosystems cannot, in fact, studies have shown that these grasslands have to be anthropogenic because we don't have enough naturally started fires in this region of California to have the kind of fire regime you need to maintain a grassland. So we know these systems are of anthropogenic origin. We're also seeing thousands and thousands of culturally modified trees. What I mean by this are trees that were pollarded, in other words, cut. The tops were cut when they were young to repeatedly to encourage much lateral branching. Pollarding is a standard practice in the fruit and nut industry, in the orchard industry, to create canopies, which are the most efficient shape in maximizing fruit, or in this case, acorn production. It also makes it a lot easier to harvest the acorns when the branches are spreading out and close to the ground versus growing high up into the air. And of course, the cultivation of oaks was a practice. Everywhere oaks grow, you can find these pollarded oaks. This is angel oak in South Carolina, and it's just a classic example of an ancient pollarded oak that I just takes my breath away every time I see oaks like this. And we have many of oaks like this in California. You also can see lots of oaks like this in Texas, and as well as England and all through the Southeast US. Anywhere oaks grow, you can find these pollarded oaks. Here's a example. So these two pictures were taken just a short distance from each other. The oak on the left was pollarded, and the oak on the right is not. So what we're seeing is that pollarded shape is where the tree grows up to about 6 feet in height, and then you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 branches coming out, or whatever, 4, 5, 6, all from one spot, and spreading outward. Whereas the same species of oak on the same climate and the same soils that you see over here on the right, that is simply younger, shows this classic dichotomous branching pattern, which is typical of untended oaks. And it's not just the oaks that were pollarded. We're seeing culturally modified pines, in this case, Monterey pine. Here's a culturally modified gray pine on the left. So again, these pictures were taken just short distance from each other. The only difference is that, this tree is much older and has a very different shape than the same species and the same soils and the same climate, but that are younger. So what we have is tended on the left, untended on the right. Then there's the curious case of the shell middens. Now, shell middens are accumulations of seashells, bone, rock, ash, anything kind of mineral, and biochar. And there are some organic remains in these middens. And they've been long interpreted as garbage piles from the native people that used to live in the area. Well, what I found striking when I started looking at shell middens is that these very large trees are growing on top of these shell middens. So there's this Monterey cypress again, and if you look closely underneath, you can see it's sitting on a shell midden. Well, back in 2006, I wrote a book chapter on ecological evidence for large-scale silviculture by California Indians. And in that chapter, I proposed the midden hypothesis. The many types of refuse mounds and middens, including shell middens, bone middens, rock middens, originate not from the gradual accumulation of waste products of daily living, but rather from the intentional stockpiling of gathered or recycled lime-rich materials for use as mineral fertilizers, among other things. And since I wrote that, I've also learned that there's actually quite an extensive amount of information showing shell middens have very significant cultural meaning in the lives. 10 years later, after I wrote that book chapter, a study came out from British Columbia on Western red cedar growing on middens, and they found that the trees were taller, have higher wood calcium, greater radial growth, and exhibited less top dieback. They concluded that coastal British Columbia is the first known example of a long-term intertidal resource, hence shell middens, using enhanced forest productivity. And we expect that this pattern to occur at archaeological sites along coastlines globally. In other words, shell middens and all kinds of middens, pottery middens, bone middens that you find in other places, all these middens may well have an influence on the soil fertility in the places that they're growing. And these middens occur virtually on almost every continent on the planet, from Australia to Africa to South America and Europe and Asia. I also want to just take a side trip to look at these terracets. In California and actually all through the Western US, you have these terraced hillsides, often near these old tended pollarded oaks. You'll see these hillsides that have these beautiful terraces. And when you talk to people about, you know, what are those? Why are they there? The almost complete standard answer is that, well, those are cattle trails. I don't know. For one, with these are cattle trails, and they don't look anything like terraces. But also, let's just ask the experts, the geomorphologists, the people that study landforms like this. And in the literature that I've been able to find, none of them believe that these are caused by cattle or sheep or whatever kind of grazing animal. First of all, there's no science or literature that even suggests that cattle and other grazing animals graze along contours. So how else could they have been formed? Here's maybe another example. Here, if these are cattle trails, where here we have an eroded hillside with these beautiful, quote, cattle trails going right up to this scar. And if the cattle really are doing contour grazing, well, they're not falling off into the scar, so they've got to be walking around it. But there's no trail that would indicate that they're kind of going around these scars. I think pretty much, in my mind, the big misconception is that no one has considered the idea that these could have been agricultural terraces by the native people. But their position and their location in the landscape keep telling me that we need to take a closer look at what these are. And if they are agricultural terraces, like I strongly suspect, then we're going to have to rethink the whole level of intensity of agriculture, at least in the Western US, because these are in all through the Western US, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Wyoming, Colorado. I've seen them in every state west of the Mississippi. So to go over some of the indigenous cultural tending in California, summary of the evidence: fire was used judiciously to create and maintain a wide diversity of ecosystems. Native people planted, tended, coppiced, and pollarded many trees and shrubs. Native people used middens to improve soil fertility and tree health, and hillsides, I believe, were terraced for agriculture. That's a lot of evidence. Back in 2005, M. Cat Anderson wrote a book, Tending the Wild, which has been kind of the Bible for a lot of us who are looking at landscapes and forests here in California and the role Native people played. And just to mention a few quotes from that book, as we now know, many of the classic landscapes of California, coastal prairies, majestic valley oak groves, montane meadows, the oak meadow mosaic of Yosemite Valley were in fact shaped by the unremitting labor of generations of Native people, and that many of these communities have disappeared, and that many of these communities have disappeared or changed radically in absence of management shows they were not self-sustaining. There are other significant compilations of work showing indigenous tending in Australia, and two really significant works are the biggest estate on Earth, how Aborigines Made Australia by Bill Gamage, and The Dark Emu by Bruce Pascoe. These books are deep dives into the role and sophistication of the native peoples of Australia in shaping and maintaining a diverse and productive ecosystem on that continent. So a lot of what we're talking about here in California can be extended to many other places in the world. So in terms of solutions, the big talk these days is cultural burning. Finally, it's taken a while, but I'm so happy that we're starting to get discussions and news items that focus on the importance of cultural burning as a management tool, as a way to deal with these catastrophic wildfires. This is how Native people used to deal with them, and we still can do that. And in fact, a lot of the cultural burning in several places here in California never really stopped. I've been excited to follow some of the Indigenous cultural burning in the news the last few years. And just in the last 4 or 5 months, we've had articles by the New York Times, Popular Science, The Guardian, The World, NPR, fascinating articles that keep pointing to the importance of cultural burning in managing California landscapes. So, but how do we help forests that can't be burned? So here's a couple pictures, one from Carmel near where I live, another in Monterey. These are small towns in small cities, really. And these forests are surrounded by homes. There's just no way you can easily put a fire in these forest systems. There's way too much fuel. There's way too much private property nearby that could get damaged. What's the option? So one of the key options that I've been working with and other scientists have worked with in the past is something we call fire mimicry. And fire mimicry is really just kind of what it sounds. Instead of going in and burning, you actually act like a force of nature and go in and clear the land, fertilize the land with ash, remove the mosses and lichens, do the tasks by hand that fire would normally do without all the smoke and flames. So here's an example of an ancient coast live oaks, probably 400 or 500-year-old coast live oak. Here it was on March 3rd, 2017, before any fire mimicry work was done. You couldn't even see the oak really from the edge of the clearing. Here we are one day after, and you can see all the work we've done, a lot of removal of invasive Douglas fir, invasive bay trees, thinning out and pruning a lot of the dead wood out of there. And you can see it's just significantly altered just in one day of work, just like fire would normally do, cleaning out the system. Now, take a note of this tree on the right. Here's another photo. That tree on the, here's that same tree on the right. Now it's on the left, but from a further perspective. So you can see same date, same tree on the left now. And you can see 3 years later that the tree has, even though we have bit different light conditions, so it's a little tricky, but I think you have a sense for this tree having improved the density and lushness of its canopy. Actually, if you look here, there are 2 young oak trees that were surrounded by Douglas fir that we left when we cleared out. We didn't cut the young oak trees down. As you can see in the photo, 3 years later, those young oak trees that were opened up and the competition around them reduced are now flourishing. Here's that same large oak from a different perspective. 3 years later, you can see that a lot of the fir have been removed and the general health of the canopy has improved. I'd like to show you some time-lapse video now. Here's a property in Boulder Creek that I worked on just a couple weeks ago. And in this picture, you can see that there's lots of young trees, lots of essentially fuel near structures where people are living. So the owners wanted to make this more fire safe. So I proposed fire mimicry, they agreed. And here's what we did in a course of about 45 minutes. So we're taking out invasive species, dead wood, thinning out the trees, getting the trees away from the structures as best we can, pruning the trees to get the wood to eliminate the ladder fuel between the ground and the canopy of the tree. Yeah, it's a lot of work, but it's very rewarding. Okay, here's another tree. Now, the last video sequence showed you just essentially the first step of fire mimicry, which is clearing around the tree, reducing the competition, reducing the fuel, the ladder fuel, the fuel that would light the canopy on fire. In this video, we're doing not just the clearing, but we're also doing the moss removal on the trunk, the compost tea application to the soil, the lime wash application to the bark, and the alkaline mineral fertilizer treatments to the soil. So watch carefully and I'll try to point out each step of the process. So the first about 2/3 of this video, we're just doing the clearing. This also reduces competition from the tree. All those woody plants are competing for the same resources this sick black oak are competing for. And we're pretty much just there. What was I doing there? At that point, I was taking the mosses off the tree, but also note that we also leave some of the vegetation material if it's out beyond the canopy. Okay, so now we're putting down the compost tea. Now I'm putting on the lime wash, and now we're spreading the soil minerals, and then we water it in, or in this case, the rains water it in. I take pictures of the trees. We come back 1 year, 2 years, year and a half, 2 years later, and these are fairly common results. Here's a tree. I actually use this one because this is an Indian Canyon, which is land that the my Coast Sonoan Ohlone colleagues live on and have are working. We're working together to help improve the coast live oaks on that Indian land in Indian Canyon. Here's and I have thousands of these pictures. I've just thrown out some recent ones here. Here's a coast live oak that was treated 5 years ago, and you can see how much the canopy has improved in terms of lushness, greenness, and density. There's another coast live oak that's shown pretty dramatic improvement over the course of 7 years. And it's not just oaks. We can go in and we can improve the health of coast redwoods. In this case, here's a coast redwood over the course of just 2 years, going from very sickly to a nice, healthy recovery. And there's also some exciting findings we've had in areas that we've treated with fire mimicry that have since burned. So in the Sonoma fire back in October 2017, there were a couple properties in Sonoma that I had done fire mimicry work on that then burned. And then when so prior to the Sonoma fire on these properties, we did fire mimicry. So we did a lot of the clearing and pruning. And then we took the slash and actually burnt it on site and raked the coals out among the trees to create ash and biochar fertilizer. So we spent weeks doing clearing and fertilization treatments. After the Sonoma fire, the hillsides above where we worked in fact, most of the trees were severely damaged by the fire. But essentially where the fire stopped here was the property line that we worked on. And these large ancient pollarded coast live oaks were all cleared around, pruned up, made fire safe. And indeed, the fire burned right up to these ancient oaks and did very little damage and did not continue very far. That's essentially the property line where we did the clearing. If you go down further on the same property, here you can see the fence line right here. Here's a fence line. And the fire essentially was extremely destructive on the non-cleared side of the fence line, but on the cleared side, we lost very few trees. The fire burned right up to the home, but it stayed on the ground and there was no structural damage. But the most important thing is we didn't just save the home. And this is where we have to start thinking, changing our thinking about fire clearance and fire safety. The idea of this project wasn't just to save the home, it was to save the forests, trees and forests as well. And in fact, of the hundreds and hundreds of trees that were on this property, 5-acre property, we lost only about 5 trees in this fire. So we not only saved the home, we saved the forest. And the reason I emphasize this is this was all done without changing the climate. That's why I'm a little hesitant to make climate change such a culprit in all this, because if the more people believe climate change is the cause, well, then what are the solutions? Go buy a Tesla? I don't know, but it isn't going out and actually doing the work that you need to do to keep that from happening. So to summarize, first point, over several millennia, Indigenous people have actively tended the forests and landscapes of California. The recent decline of forests and increase in catastrophic wildfires are primarily due to forests no longer being tended. And Indigenous-based tending practices are a proven approach, and I emphasize proven. We already know it works in restoring the health of California ecosystems. And here is some examples again from the Sonoma fire, showing how the fire was kept from burning structures and forests, and the trees have responded very nicely. How do we know it's proven method the Native Americans had? Well, when you look at some of the past accounts, here's a quote from Titus Fay Cronus in the Natural Worlds of California, quoted in M. Cat Anderson's book. No country in the world was as well supplied by nature as California when first discovered by the Spaniards. Every one of its first visitors have left records to this effect. They found its hills, valleys, and plains filled with elk, deer, hares, rabbits, quail, and other animals, its rivers and lakes swarming with salmon, trout, and other fish, their beds and banks covered with mussels, clams, and other mollusca, the rocks on its seashores crowded with seal and otter, and its forests full of trees and plants bearing acorns, seeds, and berries. I know we can get to that place again someday, and I look forward to being a part of that. Thank you all for listening to that. And I think at this point, I'll turn it over to Bruce, is that right?
Lee, that was wonderful. Amazing encyclopedia of information that you gave us in less than an hour. So much to absorb. I invite everybody to, there's a question and answer line at the bottom of your screen. There's a chat line as well. We'll take a look at both of them and we'll be happy to send your questions on to Lee. But just to get things started, Vicky, I think you might have a question or two, so why don't you begin?
Okay, thank you, Lee. That was a great presentation. I really appreciate that. I know that there are tribes that are trying to reinstate these traditional fire management practices in California. And I was wondering if you could tell me, what are the legal or administrative impediments or barriers to being able to institute these fire ceremonies and practices again in California?
Yeah, there are really significant barriers. And to be honest, I'm probably not the best one to ask, mainly because what happened was when I came to California about 15, 20 years ago and saw the need for fire, I actually made a pretty big effort here with a property in Big Sur to try to put fire on the land again. And worked with Tom Little Bear Nason in the project. And the project was such a, it never happened. It was such a difficult logistic and bureaucratic nightmare that it just turned me away from even want to be involved in doing those kinds of fires. So it's really, though, in a way, it was a good thing that happened for me, at least, is because it made me have to focus on not using fire to restore the health of the forest. And that's how a lot of these fire mimicry techniques started coming into play. So I could basically, I was just kind of end running around the whole system and just doing the work that needed to be done. Granted, it's a whole lot more work than fire could do in a short period of time, but I had to do something. So I do know that the regulations and bureaucracies are being eased now. I just know that secondhand, kind of following some of the discussions and news articles from Native people are sharing. But I couldn't tell you exactly how that's changed significantly, just because I've just thrown up my hands trying to deal with trying to put fire on the land here in California.
Yep, I've heard it's difficult. But even with fire mimicry, you're still burning small piles of biomass. So that must get the neighbors excited. So how do you deal with the neighborhood to explain to them what you're trying to do so they don't panic?
Yeah, so you call the neighbors. So the burning I do is the easy kind of burning, which you don't need a big special permit. You do have to get a permit for the burn piles, but it's not the bureaucracy that you need to do like a cultural burn. And there's a whole system. You call the local fire department, you call your neighbors, you could do burn piles. Fortunately, it's the hardest part is trying to schedule burning when the air quality will allow. So you can't, you almost never know until like that, the night before or that morning of the day you want to burn, whether you can burn. And kind of part of the difficulty is that here in Big Sur, for instance, we live near the coast, very distant from the Salinas Airport, where the air quality measurements are made to determine whether we can burn in Big Sur. I mean, we're 2 mountain ranges away from Salinas, and the air quality in that valley area is going to be very different than the air quality here. But it's the air quality in that valley area which is dictating whether we can burn in Big Sur or not. And I think we're going to have to start to get a little more flexible in how we permit some of the burning due to air quality issues.
Interesting. Yeah. Did you want to take one?
Well,
Bruce, or I'll keep going if you like.
We have a question from Stacy Weinberger, who sends this question to Lee. Stacy writes, I live in the East Bay in the San Francisco Bay Area. I live in an oak and bay forest. My sense is that fires would have prevented an overgrowth of bay how do we manage the bay, especially in an area that is on a hillside and many are quite large? So I take it the bay is the bay tree she's talking about here in the San Francisco Bay Area.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, it's the bay tree. There's lots of issues with bay trees. Yeah, I'm pretty aggressive in removing young bay trees. I don't tolerate bay trees underneath the canopy of any oak tree. Bays bays and oaks don't play well together. Bays are major vectors for sudden oak death disease. Bays also, but the bays actually don't get the disease. They just transfer it to the oaks, which do get the disease. Bays will also strongly compete with the oaks for water, soil nutrients. And of course, the bays also underneath the canopy of the oaks, they're shade tolerant. The bays will grow right up through the branches of the oaks and then eventually compete for light. So I try to keep any bay trees away from oaks. The mature bays, if they're outside the canopy of the oaks, I'm okay with that. I also try to thin the bays and on hillsides where we have a fire danger. But the one thing is that you can go overboard removing bays and other trees on, especially on hillsides, because sometimes on the steeper hillsides, it's those trees that are holding the slopes, keeping the slopes stable. So you have to be a little careful on removing bays and other trees on steeper hillsides. But by and large, bays are highly volatile, easily spread fire. Certainly in any kind of populated area, I am pretty aggressive at removing bay trees, particularly the younger ones.
You want to go, Vicki? We've got
Yes.
on the chat line.
Oh, is there another one?
On the chat line.
On the chat, okay. Let's see. Ah, yes. Okay, great. From Maria Amalova. Dearly, thank you for the lecture. I am a researcher from Chiba University, Japan. There's a practice of cultivating forest ecosystems in Japan called Satayama. I want to know if there's some similar cultural practices to maintain the forest healthy and productive in European communities.
So I'm not familiar with that practice called Satayama. I might have to do a quick Google search.
Anybody out there can, or maybe Maria could just quickly sketch in what that consists in?
Lee, you might compare what's happening in Australia with the practices in Australia compared to America,
Well,
the indigenous fire management practices.
yeah. Again, I've never been to Australia. Really, what I know about what they're doing over there is just what I've read. Everything I've read makes me feel like Australia, what's going on over there is very much akin to what's going on here in California. I have been in touch with a researcher, Jerskis. I'm trying to remember his first name. We communicated a couple of years ago around some things. And him and I are on the same page that there is essentially a big problem with fire suppression, causing forest decline, increasing fuel loads. Pretty much everything I've heard about what's going on in Australia is just mirrors what's happening here in California. But the nice thing about Australia is I think we have actually a bit better documentation of the actual burning regimens that the Aboriginal people were using compared to what we know about the Indigenous people here in California. I want to be careful saying that because somebody might say, no, 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 you're wrong. But that's my sense that that information has been better preserved in Australia than here in the Americas.
I see Maria put a link up to the
Right.
practice, but
Well,
can I ask you another question since I
ahead.
don't see another one coming up? We've all heard about the Joshua trees that were destroyed in California. Have you been following that at all, or do you have a solution or a remedy to try to restore what's happened?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I'm planning a trip to Joshua Tree in just another week or so, so I'll be able to answer the question better then. But I have been to Joshua Tree in the past, and I can tell you one thing: Joshua Tree is all native or traditionally native lands that used to be burned regularly. And what's happened is the Joshua trees are very tolerant to light fires around them, and that reduced competition. It actually alkalinized the soils, provided nutrients. So frequent light burning around Joshua trees is probably what helped them propagate and grow healthy for so many hundreds and hundreds of years. Now, without those regular fires, the fuels have built up, and the fires that are now burning are much hotter and more destructive. And that's why we probably lost a lot of those Joshua trees. But I'll know more in another week or so when I get down there and take a good close look.
Okay, very good.
Let me jump in at this point. In my classes, we've been reading about the new forest ecology of Dr. Suzanne Simard, who's become pretty famous studying the forest communities, the mycorrhizal networks, and the symbiotic nature of forest communities, and these are generally then compared to clear cutting practices that just sort of completely trash the place where the clear cutting happens, and then the monoculture comes in, and all the sort of dead wood is cleared out. And so sort of the lesson that we've been learning is that dead wood is good. I'm gathering from, but you're working in environmental niches where dead wood doesn't seem to be what you want to leave lying around. What's the difference we need to keep in mind between a sort of leaving the forest undisturbed so that a kind of natural turnover of living and dead trees can just sort of carry on in their, in the ecological fashion that's healthy for them, and the kind of work that you have to do where you are?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, there's many different ecosystems just on the hillside right outside the window here. And each of those has been the result of different fire strategies by the native people. So the ecosystems such as the grasslands, the chaparral, the oak woodlands, all are the result of very frequent fires, almost every year or every other year, in most cases. That in those situations, no, you wouldn't get any dead wood on the ground, and you wouldn't even want any dead wood on the ground. Really, what you've got are very open canopies that are producing very luxuriant growths of forbs, edible plants for not just people, but also the wildlife. So these are systems that have been going on like that for millennia. The places where you want more dead wood are going to be more like your coniferous forests that you're wanting to maintain. And the dead wood is good for fungal growth and stuff. So yeah, so, you know, more like your redwood forests, we're okay with dead wood in those places. Not a lot of dead wood. You know, again, it's whatever fire would eventually allow to remain. But every one of these places burns at some fire interval here in California. So whatever dead wood is on the ground, some of it's going to burn. It's just that, you know, especially with the larger forests, where the forests with the larger trees, the dead wood is more likely to survive the fire. I will argue, though, that in the first meeting of the class a while ago, we talked what was his name, about the intelligent trees. He was making it sound like you want a crowded forest, and that's not true in many situations. If you look just in our parks, in places where trees have big open areas to grow, they're doing very well. Trees, many kinds of trees actually prefer not crowded forest conditions. Trees, many kinds of trees, oaks here in California, they don't really like forests. They want to be in a savanna, and they want to have their branches not touching any other tree. So, and they're doing very well. So I think we have to be careful saying that trees are better in forest situations. That's not always true.
Right. So, I mean, it's a basic ecological message. You just generalize at your own peril with regard to what's going to be the healthiest situation for any particular species or community.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So
It looks like we have some other questions.
Go for it.
All right. Rachel Warner's asked, what would fire mimicry look like in a secondary redwood forest, like the redwood forest found in Santa Cruz?
Well, it would first of all involve thinning out the redwoods quite a bit. I know those redwood forests in Santa Cruz, and I predicted the fire that was going to happen there because the redwoods are very dense and very crowded. So fire mimicry would pretty much involve going in and thinning out a lot of the younger trees. There's a lot of bays and dead and dying tan oaks in the redwood forest that need to be taken out because that's just fuel for the next fire that comes in. And what we're trying to do, of course, is to reduce the fuels, especially near the ground, so that when the fire burns, it stays on the ground and becomes a healthy, good fire instead of spreading to the canopy. So the focus in any kind of forest, whether it be an oak forest or a redwood forest, would be to remove the latter fuel, as well as thin out the forest to reduce the competition, because every tree in a forest is competing with for the same resources as every other tree, and there's only so many resources there. And so you have to recognize that fire would normally go in and thin those out. If we can't burn, then we have to go in and thin them out by hand.
David McConville asks, to what degree are Southern California tribes still practicing cultural burning?
Well, actually, I'm not I couldn't tell you about Southern, I mean, I know about Northern California tribes still practicing cultural burning. Those are the tribes I tend to be more in touch with. I'm sure the Southern tribes are doing burning. I just can't tell you offhand which ones. But in the North, yeah, the Yurok, the Karuk, all doing cultural burning. Miwok are doing cultural burning. The Pomo are doing cultural burning. Yeah, almost every tribe I can think about that's active in this area in the Northern California is doing cultural burning. I can't help you with Southern California.
Well, shall we try Maria's abstract here? Let me hit you with this fast and furious so we understand the Satayama practice. The Satayama landscape as a traditional Japanese rural land use system represents a balanced relationship between human beings and nature, thereby sustaining a variety of ecosystem services. Overuse of the Satayamas occurred during the Edo and early Meiji periods, seen in the wake of the fuel and fertilizer revolutions in the 60s, destroy this balance and hence the sustainability of the system. So the Satayama initiative is an effort to rebuild a healthy relationship between nature and people who respect the traditional knowledge embodied in the Satayama system, and to explore new shared management systems in which various actors, including corporations, participate in working toward the combined goals of a low carbon, resource circulating, nature harmonious society. Okay, so if I understand that, it translates into the creation of a rational consortium of human actors and natural landscapes. Are we anywhere close to that? Anywhere?
Well, in the Amazon, the traditional, no, seriously, that's probably as close as any place on earth where the indigenous people are still practicing their traditional management techniques. And but in the Americas, definitely less so, but I think we'll get back there someday. And actually the whole description of Satayama to me actually sounds very much like the approach the native people here were using. They, just with chaparral, they had 7 different burning regimens for chaparral alone, based on whether they were managing it for food or wildlife habitat. It's fascinating, the sophistication of the burning regimens that the native people here in California had. Yeah.
All right. Lime wash. Okay. Is that to restore alkalinity? I thought it's really fascinating about the mosses in particular jacking up the acidity, which I tend to think of in terms of climate change. It's the acidity of the oceans is rising because of the surplus of carbon dioxide. Is that a comparable?
No.
No. Okay.
Yeah, no, because that's a CO2 driven thing in the oceans, and the acidity here is a different source of acidity. Yeah, the lime wash is actually an ancient practice. It's done on, again, almost every continent I've been to, mainly in the cultures that are influenced by indigenous people. You see it more commonly. And it's a practice that involves essentially applying this mineral poultice onto the trunk of the tree, which serves to discourage pathogens, discourage insect pests. It creates, actually, for instance, a lot of the insect pests that attack the trees are camouflaged against the bark of the trees. So you paint the tree white with the lime wash, and all of a sudden the birds can see the insect pests and feed on them more. I don't know how big of effect that is, but that's been explained to me as a part of the reason lime wash can be helpful. Of course, lime wash also creates an environment the mosses and lichens don't grow on. So there's a lot of benefit. Also, you can see the trees at night when you're driving along the car, and you're less likely to hit them. So there's a lot of protective advantages of lime wash.
All right.
I have one more
Go ahead.
question. Yes, I just want to mention that we're under a fire weather watch until tomorrow morning. So even though we don't have a lot of trees, the ones we do have are in jeopardy a lot of the time. So
Here in Lubbock, you mean?
Yes, here in Lubbock. One of the questions I had is, I wondered when you do your fire mimicry practices, do you have to be careful not to create a monoculture, or does it matter?
Well, yeah, so good question. Yeah, you do have to be a little careful. Like, you don't just go in there and clear everything. Like, actually, in one of the videos, I don't know if you noticed, I didn't really point it out, but there was one small tree underneath in the second video, the black oak, there was one small tree kind of behind the black oak that we didn't clear, and it was an elderberry. Okay, so there's certain, so like hazelnuts and elderberries and toyons, depending on where they are in the system, yes, we don't try to take everything down. So that, yeah, good question. That's an important point. And that's why it's really good to have, you know, trained people out there clearing, not just people that know how to use a chainsaw, but people that can identify what it is they're cutting down. Man, a couple of years ago, we were clearing this redwood forest and I found this beautiful young tan oak that I was like, oh, great. We're gonna leave the tan oak here. And because tan oaks have been really getting hit hard by diseases here. And I turned my back and 5 minutes later, one of my colleagues had cut it down and I was, oh no. So yeah, you have to be careful not to create a monoculture and leave some diversity in these sites that, yeah, good question.
I've got a question. This might be a nice way to cap it off. Although if other questions pop up, I think we could probably continue. But you began with Gaia theory, and that's how I got to know you, Lee, because we're both, you know, students of Lovelock and Margulis, and but you presented Gaia theory in its large dimensions as a theory of planetary self-regulation and sort of maintenance of habitable conditions generally for all the biota. But I'm wondering to what extent the Gaian considerations are at play, even implicitly in the hands-on kind of work that you do.
Yeah, I think the main point I was trying to make there is that at least in my world, my Gaian world, ecosystems are the fundamental units, subunits of Gaia. Until people start thinking about the role of like the different biomes, okay, the tundra biome, the rainforest biome, the desert biome, all these are major organs of the earth, the peatland biome. That's how we have to start looking at Gaia as a compilation of ecosystems, not a compilation of organisms. And I think that's all the further I want to get into it right now.
Yeah.
You see?
Sure. Yeah. That, I mean, I think we know that was Lynn's more of Margulis's insistence on the ecosystemic understanding of Gaia. But yeah, you need healthy organs, man,
Yeah.
to keep this planetary body moving along. Okay. What do you think, Mike? Is that a wrap?
Yeah, I think that would be, I think that's a good idea to end on. I like that. I like we've come full circle over the course of the evening back to Gaia theory. I think that's a wonderful ending. Thank you very much, so much to Lee Klinger for an engaging lecture and for a really fitting crescendo to a semester's worth of great events under the forest theme. I'm grateful too to Vicki and to Bruce, and in particular to Bruce and the programming team who put together all of these events that we've hosted this fall. And we look ahead to all the events for spring. So one more time, thanks very much, Lee, for sharing all of this tonight. We're grateful. And all of you, please follow us on our website and social media and look ahead to our Spring Forest event. Have a great evening.
Thanks,
Great.
Lee.
Thank
Great.
you. Had a great
Okay.
Thank
time.
you.
Thank you.
I want to
Good
do it
work.
again.
Sounds great. Okay.